At 9:20 a.m. on June 4, 1942, roughly 200 miles north of Midway, 15 Douglas TBD torpedo aircraft, Torpedo Squadron 8, turned in alone. 4 Japanese carriers were in the formation below. No dive bomber cover, no fighter protection. The squadron leader was Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron. Waldron's aircraft had taken the lower altitude track, separated from the rest of the strike, then turned north, found the carriers, and committed without support. That separation was not an accident in the cockpit. It was a choice made while options were disappearing. As the squadron drove in, the Japanese response arrived exactly as doctrine predicted. Fighters forced down to sea level, and a hard anti-aircraft screen rising from destroyers and cruisers. Aircraft began dropping out of the formation one by one. None of the 15 came back. The torpedoes did not decide the outcome, but the altitude did. The carrier fighters concentrated on the low threat, leaving fewer in position when the high-angle attack arrived minutes later. Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron did not hold a glamorous billet. He was the commanding officer of Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8. Assigned to the fleet carrier USS Hornet, CV-8, in the North Pacific, his role was simple on paper. Take a torpedo bomber, carry a single weapon, and deliver it into the most protected water on the chart. It was a job built around straight runs and predictable angles, exactly the kind of flying the enemy could prepare to punish. The torpedo profile made the aircraft's weakness operational, not theoretical. To release properly, crews had to descend low, level out, and hold a steady approach long enough for the weapon to enter cleanly. That meant committing early, staying visible, and absorbing fire while closing the distance. Within the carrier air group, the Devastator did not inspire confidence. It inspired calculations about how long it could survive once it was seen. Waldron's background did not match the stereotype of a carrier ace. He graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy, class of 1924, and earned his wings in 1927. A large portion of his career was spent where competence had to be documented, not performed. Teaching aviation at the Naval Academy, instructing at Pensacola, rotating through flying billets that rewarded repeatable procedure and hard standards. He was not known for being loud. He was known for making mistakes expensive because he prevented them. He also carried an education that did not advertise itself on a flight deck. Waldron studied law and was admitted to the bar, then never practiced. It did not make him dramatic. It made him exact. He read dense material, extracted what mattered, and ignored what didn't. In briefings, that showed up as questions that were too specific, asked too early, in rooms that preferred reassurance to precision. By the late 1930s and into 1941, his postings tightened around ordnance and measurement. He served at the Naval Proving Ground, Dahlgren. He worked at the Bureau of Ordnance. He was later assigned as a Naval Inspector of Ordnance at the Carl L. Norden plant in New York, where the Norden bomb site was built. None of those tours made a man popular at parties. They made him dangerous in the quiet places where systems fail, where tolerances, calibration, and timing decide whether a weapon performs as promised. Waldron learned to distrust assumptions that could not survive inspection and to treat close enough as a future casualty list. In the summer of 1941, he was detached from that technical track and given command of something new. VT-8, formed for the new carrier Hornet while the ship was still coming together. A new squadron had to be built from personnel, aircraft, and habit. Waldron built it like a procedure. He drilled formation integrity. He drilled torpedo approach discipline. He drilled radio restraint, enough to communicate, not enough to advertise. He trained his crews to fly the numbers because the weapon demanded it, and because the enemy would exploit anything else. That approach made him useful and easy to underestimate. In a carrier air group, the prestige naturally tilted toward the aircraft that climbed fast and struck from altitude. fighters and dive bombers, machines that could convert speed into options. Torpedo planes converted speed into vulnerability. Their success depended on timing, on coordination, and on a willingness to hold the same course while the sea and the guns tried to force a correction. Waldron did not try to make torpedo work look heroic. He treated it like an engineering problem with hostile variables: the torpedo's performance limits, the aircraft's speed, the geometry of the run, the enemy's reaction time. He was also quietly difficult to move once he believed the math was against a plan. He had little patience for routes that relied on luck. When a proposed course did not fit a contact report or a navigation plot, he said so, not theatrically, not to score points, just enough to put the discrepancy in the air where it could not be ignored. That kind of posture can read as stubbornness when everything is calm. It reads differently when a strike group is burning fuel over open water and every degree of heading matters. On Hornet, in the days closing on Midway, VT-8 carried a quiet reputation inside the ship. Disciplined, serious, and, because of what they flew, expected to pay first. The Devastator's limitations were not a secret to anyone who watched it launch. The squadron's crews understood their speed, their defensive armament, and the long, exposed run their weapon required. Waldron trained them anyway, with the calm insistence of a man who treated inevitability as something to be managed rather than feared. The credential he carried into the battle was not a nickname or a decoration. It was competence in the unglamorous details: reading a plot, weighing a report against a heading, and understanding what a few degrees of course error becomes after an hour over empty sea. Waldron had spent enough years around ordnance and instruction to treat errors as cumulative and fatal. He built VT-8 to fly precisely because the weapon required precision, and because precision was one of the only advantages a slow squadron could still control. By the morning of June 4th, the carrier deck would hand him an opportunity, a narrow chance to prove that accuracy and insistence could still shape an outcome measured in minutes. It would also hand him the risk that comes with being right too early. No room to be wrong, and no safe way to be right. By early June 1942, torpedo doctrine in the Pacific carried a pattern that was getting harder to ignore: high losses, low returns. The weapon demanded a straight, low approach. The aircraft delivering it had to slow down, descend, and stay predictable at the exact moment the enemy's fire became most accurate. Even when crews reached range, the weapon still had to run true. The math was brutal. The squadron knew it. The ship knew it. The people writing the orders knew it. The enemy advantage wasn't vague, it was layered. A carrier force did not wait to be surprised. It traveled with a screen of destroyers and cruisers, aircraft already in the air, and fighters positioned to react fast. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol could choose where to spend altitude and speed. Torpedo planes could not. They had one profile that worked, and the enemy had trained to punish it. The standard approach, torpedo planes in low, dive bombers from high, only worked if timing was tight. If timing slipped, the low planes arrived alone, and the enemy had time to solve them one at a time. That morning, urgency began before the first American aircraft left the deck. The enemy had already launched against Midway. That meant the Japanese carriers were not only present, they were actively cycling aircraft, rearming, and moving. Every minute after first contact was a minute the target could shift position and posture. Every minute also increased the risk that the enemy would turn the search outward and find the American carriers first. There was no safe, later. There was only before the next cycle, and no one on the Hornet had the luxury of pretending the schedule belonged to them. The standard solution for hitting a carrier force was coordination: fighters to cover, dive bombers to distract and damage, torpedo planes to force evasive turns and finish what was slowed or burning. On paper, it was a system. In practice, it depended on three fragile things: accurate location, shared timing, and enough fuel to correct errors. Lose anyone and the rest started to collapse. The enemy could absorb one strike. It could not absorb repeated strikes arriving on a tight clock. So the American plan relied on compressing everything into one narrow window. But locating a moving carrier force over open ocean is not a problem you solve with confidence. It is a problem you solve with estimates, and estimates degrade with time. A bearing that was correct 30 minutes ago becomes a search sector. A sector becomes a guess. Radio silence protects surprise but also protects mistakes. Navigation over empty water offers no correction points. The air group had charts, compasses, and dead reckoning, good tools when the plot is stable. That morning the plot was not stable. Every extra mile flown in the wrong direction was fuel that could not be recovered later. That is why conventional solutions weren't working even before contact. A strike group that misses its target does not get to reset and try again. The aircraft do not have the endurance to sweep wide and then return to the carrier with reserve. They have enough fuel to fly to a predicted point, search briefly, then either find the enemy or begin the return. That creates a pressure the enemy does not share. The enemy can maneuver, the strike must commit. The strike's margin for error shrinks with every minute in the air, whether the enemy is seen or not. Inside VT-8, the problem had an additional edge. Even a successful torpedo run required exposure at the worst altitude. Torpedo planes could not loiter high while waiting for the dive bombers to arrive. They could not keep their speed and still release correctly. They had to go down and stay down. That meant timing had to be perfect, because once they descended into the engagement zone, the enemy's fighters could meet them on terms that favored the fighters. The squadron's best-case scenario still involved taking fire for longer than anyone else in the air group. Command pressure shows itself in what is not said. There were no speeches. There was no reassurance that losses would be acceptable. There was only the expectation that the strike would go, that it would find, and that it would hit. Carrier warfare rewards the side that compresses decisions into minutes and forces the other side to react. That morning, the American carriers were trying to do exactly that. The problem was that the clock was running on both sides, and the margin belonged to the side that could stay flexible. For Waldron, the unsolved problem narrowed to one point: how to arrive on target with the weapon still usable and the formation still intact. If VT-8 arrived late, it would arrive alone. If it arrived early, it would still arrive alone. If it followed the wrong vector, it would arrive nowhere. Conventional answers, stay with the main strike, hold formation, trust the plotted course, only worked if the plot was right and the timing stayed synchronized. That morning, neither of those conditions could be guaranteed. By the time the aircraft were ready to launch, the plan still looked orderly on paper. In the air, it would become something else. A long flight over empty water with no landmarks, a moving target that could not be confirmed until it was in sight, and a weapon that demanded a straight run into the densest defense afloat. The opportunity was real. The risk was already airborne. At 7:02 a.m. on June 4th, VT-8 launched from USS Hornet as part of a long-range strike into open ocean. It was the squadron's first combat mission. 15 aircraft, 30 men, 1 torpedo per plane. The task was defined in advance: reach the reported enemy position, attack, return. There were no alternate objectives worth fuel. The environment did not make that task easier. A weather boundary sat in the operating area, with visibility reported around 6 to 12 miles, and cloud conditions changing across the sector. For crews navigating over water with no landmarks, that meant the horizon could be reliable one minute and unhelpful the next. A carrier strike can accept uncertainty for only so long before uncertainty becomes the mission. The strike group did not fly as one body. The Hornet Action Report later summarized a split profile. VT-8 maintained a slow advance below the clouds, about 100 knots, while the rest of the group climbed and moved faster. building altitude and spacing that could not be recovered once the flight was committed. In practical terms, the torpedo squadron was trading speed for a stable platform and navigational certainty. The cost was isolation. This is where Waldron's competence first mattered and where it was easiest to miss. The early phase of a carrier strike is not combat. It is math under a time limit. Heading, wind correction, fuel burn, and the small errors that grow into misses. Waldron's squadron was low and slow, beneath a ceiling that could swallow the higher elements from sight. He kept his formation tight enough to be controlled without broadcasting constant radio calls. He held the squadron at a pace that the torpedo and the aircraft could sustain. That was not dramatic. It was disciplined, because discipline was the only thing that still belonged to them. Then the first real pressure arrived, uncertainty about where the enemy actually was. The operational problem for the morning was simple to state and hard to solve. The target was moving, reports were incomplete, and the flight was burning fuel with every mile. Conventional thinking says, stay with the strike leader, fly the briefed course, assume the contact plot holds. That approach works until the first assumption fails, then it becomes a long flight to nowhere. Waldron's decision point was quiet. There was no visible enemy yet, no tracer fire, no urgency that could be felt physically. Just a growing mismatch between expected geometry and what a careful navigator would accept. When Waldron broke from the main body and took VT-8 onto a different line of advance, he was not buying advantage. He was buying a chance to make contact at all. The risk was immediate. Once separated, the squadron would not be recovered by the rest of the group. If he was wrong, VT-8 would spend the rest of its fuel proving it. They flew on, low altitude. Under a cloud layer has its own kind of confinement. The water below stays constant. The sky above closes options. Visibility comes in segments. A ship's silhouette can appear and disappear behind haze and broken cloud. There is no terrain to help, only distance and time. The squadron maintained speed and spacing. They did not spread into a wide search that would dissolve control. They stayed together because a torpedo squadron that arrives in pieces does not arrive. At approximately 9:20 a.m., Waldron's judgment produced a clean result. The Japanese carrier force came into view, and he transmitted the contact. The enemy located. It was the first proof that his insistence on heading and timing was not stubbornness. It was accuracy under conditions where accuracy was the entire mission. That message did not solve the battle. It solved only the immediate problem. Find the carriers before fuel makes the decision for you. VT-8 had the enemy in front of them, but contact is only the start of the pressure curve. Once the carriers were sighted, everything that had been abstract became physical. Fighters in the air, escorts in motion, defensive fire waiting for altitude and range to collapse. Waldron's squadron held course and began the next phase without ceremony. The opportunity was now visible. The risk was now measurable. And the enemy, until this moment a set of coordinates, was already adapting. The first sighting did not buy them surprise. It bought them certainty. And certainty is something the enemy can respond to. From VT-8's altitude, the carrier force presented as a moving system, not four targets. A ring of escorts on the perimeter. Multiple wakes crossing at disciplined angles. Fighters already airborne, not scrambling. Even before the first American aircraft committed downward, the Japanese formation was already behaving like a unit that expected to be attacked. Waldron held the squadron together and began shifting from navigation to execution. That shift is where the margins started collapsing. Over empty water, time is measured in fuel and headings. Over a carrier force, time is measured in range. Every mile closer meant less room to correct, less room to coordinate, less room to wait for anyone else. The enemy reacted early, before torpedoes were a factor. Fighters began sliding down from altitude in controlled arcs, not chasing individual aircraft yet, but positioning to force the torpedo planes into a decision. Turn away now and preserve aircraft, or continue straight and accept that the intercept would happen inside the release corridor. This is where conventional solutions stopped being useful. The standard ideal, torpedo planes arriving simultaneously with dive bombers, fighters covering the approach, was no longer available. VT-8 was alone at the wrong altitude for waiting. They could not climb without losing time and stability. They could not widen the approach without losing formation control and fuel. The only solution still on the table was the one torpedo squadrons always hated because it was simple: commit anyway. Waldron's problem was no longer find the carriers. It was reach a release point before the formation is peeled apart. That is a decision problem, not a flying problem. Skill keeps the aircraft steady. Decision-making chooses where to spend the aircraft. He chose an approach that kept the squadron as one body, not a scattered set of individual runs. That choice was not stubbornness, it was math. A single torpedo bomber can be solved quickly by a single fighter. A line of 15 forces the enemy to distribute attention, at least briefly. Briefly was all Waldron could buy. As VT-8 descended and stabilized at low level, the enemy adjusted again. The fighter passes became more deliberate, slashing attacks that exploited speed and altitude to strike, then climb just enough to reset, then strike again. The goal wasn't to dogfight, it was to break the line. Once the line fractured, the torpedo profile became impossible. Aircraft forced to weave, forced to climb or dive to evade, forced off the steady course that a torpedo required. At the same time, the surface screen tightened. Destroyers on the perimeter did what escort ships were designed to do. They put themselves between the carriers and the threat. Their courses shifted to create crossing fire. Their guns did not need to hit a torpedo bomber at long range. They only needed to make the approach unstable. A torpedo released at the wrong speed, the wrong altitude, or the wrong angle is not a weapon. It's dead weight. The margins narrowed in layers. Altitude margin was already gone. Torpedo planes could not trade altitude for speed without sacrificing the weapon. Time margin was shrinking with every second the fighters spent above them, deciding when to strike. Formation margin was under attack by design. The enemy wasn't trying to win a dramatic engagement, it was trying to erase the conditions required for a torpedo run. Waldron did not respond with improvisation. He responded with restraint. He kept the squadron on a track that preserved the possibility of release. That restraint is easy to misunderstand from the outside. It can look like refusing to evade. In reality, it was selecting a loss he could measure over a loss he couldn't. The enemy learned quickly what kind of formation this was. VT-8 wasn't breaking into individual survival moves. It wasn't scattering to reduce losses. That told the Japanese pilots something useful. The squadron leader was going to press into the envelope, and the squadron was going to follow him. So the countermeasure became more aggressive and more focused. Fighters stopped making general deterrent passes and began systematically removing aircraft from the line, starting from the edges and working inward. The same way you dismantle a formation you want to collapse. By the time the first aircraft began dropping away, the tactical situation had clarified into something stark. There would be no clean, coordinated strike. There would be no timing rescue from above. There would be no second run. What remained was a shrinking corridor of water, leading toward a carrier silhouette, with fighters now committed low, and flak thickening as range closed. Waldron's competence had brought VT-8 to the enemy. Decision-making would determine what they did with the last few minutes they still controlled. He kept them moving in. By 9:55 a.m., the approach had stopped being a navigation problem and become a geometry problem measured in seconds. VT-8 was down at torpedo altitude, low enough that the sea was no longer background. It was a boundary. Any mistake in height or speed would either ruin the drop or put an aircraft into the water before the enemy even fired. From the Japanese side, the solution was already in motion. Fighters did not climb to hunt. They descended to control. At sea level, the torpedo planes had fewer options, fewer escape angles, and fewer ways to trade altitude for time. The enemy did not need to guess what VT-8 intended to do. A torpedo squadron has one usable profile, and the enemy had trained to meet it. Waldron kept the squadron on a steady line anyway. Not because he believed it was safe, but because he understood what instability would cost. Torpedoes demanded clean release conditions. Evasive maneuvering would keep crews alive for seconds longer, while making the weapon unusable. In that trade, the weapon mattered. It was the entire purpose of being there. The first fighter passes weren't aimed at heroic destruction. They were aimed at disruption. A torpedo squadron becomes harmless the moment it stops flying like a torpedo squadron. Fighters came in fast, low, and slightly offset, forcing pilots to choose between keeping their approach stable or breaking formation to survive. Every time an aircraft jinked, the formation widened. Every time the formation widened, mutual support vanished. That wasn't a battle in the cinematic sense. It was a controlled dismantling. At the edge of the carrier screen, destroyers began working as if they were solving an engineering problem. They turned to place themselves between the carriers and the oncoming line. They threw up spray and smoke. They shifted their tracks to complicate range estimation and to create crossing fire. The goal wasn't to sink torpedo planes with gunfire alone. The goal was to make the approach corridor so violent that release became guesswork. Here is where the hunter became the hunted. VT-8 had come to find the carriers. Now the carriers were using VT-8 to shape the airspace above them. The torpedo planes, slow, low, predictable, became bait in a layered defense. Fighters dragged down to sea level to kill them, and in doing so, pulled themselves away from where they would be needed next. This was not an accident the Japanese stumbled into mid-fight. It was doctrine. If you force the low threat to commit, and you solve it at low altitude, you reduce the immediate danger to the ships, and you keep the high-altitude threat from receiving an easy escort through your fighter screen. The Japanese fighters committed to the low fight because the low fight was the most visible, the most immediate, and the one their training promised they could end quickly. Waldron's problem was timing. Torpedo attack success doesn't come from aggression alone. It comes from arriving at the right range, on the right heading, with enough stability to release, before fighters remove the aircraft one by one. Timing pressure was now absolute. If he waited for better conditions would never arrive. If he tried to widen the run for a cleaner angle, the carriers would keep moving, and escorts would keep shifting. Every correction consumed what little time he still controlled. Misdirection was constant. The carriers did not hold still as if accepting an attack. They turned away to lengthen the approach. A carrier force can trade sea room for time, and time is what a torpedo squadron cannot afford. Each evasive turn forced VT-8 to chase a moving target while staying low and steady. That chase lengthened exposure under fighter passes. It also forced the squadron to decide whether to commit to one carrier or to split. Splitting would create more attack vectors, but would also create smaller, easier-to-kill fragments. Waldron did not split. A split would have looked flexible. It would have been a gift to the defense. He held the line toward the carriers that presented the best release geometry, close enough that a torpedo could still run true, far enough that the aircraft were still in the air. He committed to the idea that one solid run, however brief, had more value than several broken runs that never released cleanly. The consequences for mistakes were immediate and mechanical. A torpedo dropped too high would strike the sea and fail. A torpedo dropped too fast would porpoise or run erratically. A torpedo dropped at the wrong angle would miss even if it ran perfectly. And every forced correction made those errors more likely. Fighters understood that. They didn't have to kill every aircraft. They only had to make the squadron unable to execute. Aircraft began falling out of formation. Some were hit and disappeared in spray. Others were forced away by damage, leaving gaps that turned the squadron from a line into a scattered set of individual targets. The more the formation broke, the more the fighters could stop disrupting and start finishing. Waldron kept the survivors driving forward. This is where the title's promise becomes true. Not in the way the title suggests, but in the way the battle actually worked. VT-8's run did not deliver a visible torpedo hit. What it delivered was altitude displacement. The Japanese fighter cover was now down at sea level, committed to a low-altitude solution, burning time and ammunition against aircraft that could not climb away. That meant fewer fighters were positioned high, with energy, to meet what was coming next. And what was coming next was not visible to VT-8. It didn't need to be. The carrier defense had a limited capacity to fight two wars at two altitudes at the same time. The enemy chose to win the low war first. VT-8 forced that choice by refusing to disappear, refusing to scatter, and refusing to turn away early enough to save itself. In the last moments of the approach, the run became a narrow corridor of water and tracer fire. Waldron held the aircraft steady long enough to keep the attack real, even as the squadron was being erased from the sky. Whatever torpedoes entered the water did so under conditions that had already been poisoned by the defense: evasive turns, disrupted spacing, and forced corrections. The weapon did not decide the immediate outcome, but the enemy's response did. Minutes later, while fighters were still low, still focused, still finishing what remained of the torpedo attack, dive bombers would arrive above the carrier force into a sky that was temporarily less protected than it should have been. The shift was not dramatic from the surface. It was a gap measured in altitude, timing, and attention. VT-8 did not sink 4 carriers by itself. It did something more precise and more useful. It pulled the defense out of position at exactly the wrong time. Waldron's squadron was gone. The opening remained. On the flight out, Hornet's air group followed a prescribed course that assumed the enemy would be where the plot said the enemy should be. That assumption had a cost measured in fuel. Waldron recognized it early enough to object, and then once airborne, he acted on it. Multiple accounts describe the strike taking a bearing about 265, essentially due west, and Waldron's VT-8 breaking away from that line. It was not dramatic in the air. It was a quiet divergence that either produced contact or produced nothing. Step 1 was recognition. The most dangerous place to be was not over the carriers. It was over open water, late, with the wrong heading, watching the fuel state decide the outcome. Waldron's choice reframed the mission. He stopped treating the briefed line as a plan and started treating it as a potential failure mode. The risk wasn't just missing the target, it was delivering the entire air group into a search pattern that could not be afforded. Step 2 was restraint. He kept VT-8 low and slow under the cloud layer while other elements climbed away, creating separation that could not be fixed later. The Hornet Action Report notes VT-8 flying at roughly 100 knots below the clouds while the remainder of the group flew faster and climbed to high altitude. That profile looks like caution until you understand the constraint. Torpedo aircraft could not simply climb, sprint, and still expect a stable torpedo run at the end. Waldron conserved what mattered: formation control and a usable weapon profile, at the expense of companionship. Step 3 was using the enemy's plan against them. Waldron understood what the Japanese defense would do to torpedo aircraft, because the defense only had one rational answer: force the fight down to sea level and solve the threat there. Torpedo planes are predictable by design. They must descend, level out, and hold a straight course long enough to release. Fighters know where they'll be and when. Destroyers know where to put crossing fire. The trap for a torpedo squadron is to behave like individual aircraft: scatter, evade, chase turns, until the attack stops being an attack and becomes a sequence of survivals that never release a weapon. So he refused to rush and he refused to fragment. When contact was made, Waldron did not turn VT-8 into a loose set of independent runs. He executed what another squadron commander later described as a book-style attack, deploying from a structured formation to a line-abreast approach. That kind of deployment isn't about heroics, it's about forcing the defense to commit its attention across a front. It is the opposite of panic. It is what you do when you know you will be engaged, and you want the engagement to consume the enemy's options, not yours. This is where patience mattered, because the defense wanted the torpedo bombers to be impatient. A rushed torpedo drop is a miss. A rushed turn to get in faster breaks the release envelope. A rushed climb to dodge fighters removes the weapon entirely. Waldron held the line long enough to keep the torpedo run real, long enough that Japanese fighters had to stay down and keep solving it. In that moment, VT-8 stopped being the hunter and became the mechanism that pinned the hunter to a low-altitude fight. The Japanese pilots adapted correctly. They didn't try to dogfight. They tried to dismantle the geometry. They used fast, disciplined passes to break alignment and spacing, because a torpedo aircraft that is maneuvering is not releasing a torpedo correctly. They were not chasing glory, they were enforcing a defensive plan designed to erase the conditions of attack. That adaptation increased risk in a way that was immediate and cumulative. Every aircraft lost widened the formation, and every widening made the next aircraft easier to isolate. Waldron's restraint showed again in what he didn't do. He didn't wait for a perfect moment that would never arrive. He didn't waste seconds trying to rejoin higher elements that were already gone. He didn't scatter his squadron into multiple partial attacks that would each be solved quickly. He took the only path left that could still produce an operational effect, a disciplined, low-level commitment that would hold enemy fighters at sea level. That is the part that delivers the title. VT-8's torpedoes did not produce visible hits. The record is blunt about the outcome. The squadron was destroyed in the attack, with only one aircrewman surviving the immediate action in the water. But the defensive response they drew was not free for the Japanese. Fighters that are down on the deck, engaged, are not above the carriers with energy to intercept what arrives next. A carrier defense can be excellent and still be forced into a choice about altitude and timing. Waldron's plan exploited that choice by making the low-altitude problem impossible to ignore. In practical terms, he converted certain loss into temporary positional advantage, measured not in distance but in where the enemy's fighter cover was looking. The decision chain only works if you accept three constraints at once. The navigation correction must be made early enough to find the carriers at all. The torpedo profile must be protected from survival maneuvers that would ruin the weapon. The attack must be structured tightly enough that the enemy commits to finishing it. Low. Waldron executed all three under compression: fuel, time, separation, and the first wave of interception already descending. By the time the last aircraft was gone, the Japanese had done what their doctrine demanded. They had pressed fighters down to the surface fight and kept them there long enough to complete the kill. That was correct action against torpedo aircraft. It was also the moment the defense became thin in the one place it could not afford to be thin: above the carriers, where an attack from altitude needs only minutes, not hours. The opening did not look like an opening from sea level. It never does. It looked like completion, a low threat eliminated. Above that, the clock was still running. The next day, VT-8 began its run. 15 torpedo aircraft leveled out low over the water and held a steady approach toward a moving carrier formation. They were already separated from their intended fighter cover. The squadron had no spare fuel for a second search, no time to wait for synchronization, and no practical way to climb out and reset without losing the weapon profile. This was the last usable window they would have. The Japanese response arrived in layers, not all at once. Fighters dropped down first, fast. Controlled passes designed to break alignment. The goal was not conversation, it was removal. A torpedo plane that is forced to maneuver aggressively cannot release correctly. A torpedo plane that holds steady becomes a predictable target. Either way, the defense has an answer. Waldron kept the formation pointed in. He did not chase a perfect angle. He did not widen the run to look safer. He maintained the one thing the squadron could still control: the approach staying coherent long enough to be an attack, not a scatter. That discipline cost time at sea level, time the fighters could spend repeatedly. Then the surface fire became a second boundary. Destroyers on the screen shifted to place themselves between the carriers and the line of approach. The anti-aircraft pattern thickened with range. Spray columns and tracers began to mark the corridor the squadron had to pass through. The aircraft were low enough that any damage had immediate consequences. No altitude to trade for recovery, no room to absorb a mistake. Aircraft began dropping out. Not in a single dramatic moment. One at a time, as if the defense was checking items off a list. The margin for survival narrowed to simple arithmetic. Fewer planes meant fewer simultaneous threats, which meant each remaining aircraft attracted more attention. The defense didn't need to guess who to prioritize. It prioritized the aircraft still aligned for release. There was no backup. No second squadron came in behind VT-8 at the same altitude to share the load. No fighters arrived to peel off the interceptors. The only assistance VT-8 could expect was time, and time was being spent against them. As the run tightened, the carriers began turning away, lengthening the approach, and forcing the torpedo planes to chase on a straight line. It was an evasion that protected the ships while increasing exposure for the attackers. The torpedo profile demanded steadiness. The enemy's maneuvers were designed to punish steadiness. Waldron continued the run anyway. This is the point where the story stops being about whether the torpedoes hit. It becomes about where the enemy's fighters are forced to be. The Japanese combat air patrol remained down on the deck, committed to finishing a low-altitude problem that would not go away on its own. The defense could not ignore VT-8, because ignoring it meant accepting a torpedo run. So the defense stayed low and solved it low. By the time the last aircraft reached release range, the sky above the carriers was not empty, but it was different. Fighters that are engaged at sea level are not positioned with altitude and speed to meet an attack from above at the exact second it arrives. They have to climb back into it. Climbing takes time. Time was the one resource the carrier force did not have in the next phase. At about 10:20 a.m., the carrier decks were still in the middle of their own cycle, recovering aircraft, moving fueled planes, shifting ordnance, trying to prepare the next strike. That work made the decks crowded and the hangar spaces vulnerable. It was routine carrier activity under pressure, and it reduced their tolerance for interruption. Then the interruption arrived from above. Dive bombers came in high while the low-altitude fight was still occupying the defenders' attention. Bombs struck carriers, and the flight decks changed state in seconds, from operating surfaces to fire and debris. One ship after another became unusable for flight operations. The sequence was fast enough that it looked coordinated, even though it was the product of timing and opportunity, not choreography. VT-8 did not witness that from formation. VT-8 was already gone. But the airspace it forced the enemy to occupy, low, committed, finishing, was still part of the record. On the carriers, there was no ceremony attached to the losses. A strike was launched. A strike was expected back. When aircraft did not return, the absence was recorded in counts and empty deck space. The report language that follows an event like this is deliberate. It avoids speculation. It lists what was seen, what was not seen, and what cannot be confirmed. VT-8's result is stated plainly. No torpedo hits recorded. Losses total. The entry does not explain how it felt, because it is not there to explain feelings. One man remained alive in the water. Ensign George Gay went down with his aircraft and surfaced under fire with limited options: a flotation device, the sea, and the discipline to stay still. He did not have a radio that could change anything. He did not have a weapon that mattered. He had time, too much of it, and a viewpoint no one else could hold. From that low vantage point, he watched smoke pillars rise and carriers burn. He could not move to confirm details. He could only observe and remember the order in which ships changed, the pattern of aircraft overhead, and the way the battle's sound shifted once the carriers stopped operating. When he was recovered later, his value was not in a speech, it was in confirmation. He could tell staff officers what he saw, which ships were burning, and which were already out of action. He could verify that the enemy carrier force had been damaged in a way that mattered. He did it without embellishment, because the men listening did not have time for embellishment. Waldron did not return. In the paperwork that followed, the recognition came the way the Navy often handles events it doesn't romanticize. Citations, unit awards, lines typed into a permanent record. Waldron's name was attached to a posthumous award. VT-8 received a unit citation. None of it changed what happened at 9:20 a.m. None of it brought aircraft back onto the deck. But there was a subtle shift that remained after the ink dried. A torpedo squadron that missed had still forced the enemy to spend its best fighters at the worst altitude, at the worst time. A formation that was erased had still shaped where the defense looked and how it moved. In the language of outcomes, VT-8 failed to hit. In the language of timing, VT-8 forced a choice the enemy could not undo fast enough. The file closes without triumph. The battle doesn't end with a cheer in the record. It ends with a carrier deck returning to routine, recovering aircraft, counting losses, writing the next order, while a few men, quietly, understand that a decisive moment can be created by people who do not live to see it. So here's the question that doesn't resolve cleanly. If an attack scores no hits, but forces the enemy's defenses out of position long enough for the killing blow to land, what should the record call that, and how would you measure its value?